Hi, loyal subscribers and newcomers. You may have seen my video on buprenorphine and naloxone, also known as Suboxone. In that video, I explained why naloxone is added to the formulation, or at least according to the producer, why it is added to the formulation. In this video, I'm going to reveal a misconception that I had, and likely one that many others still have today regarding this combination drug. Now let's get some important background information out of the way. Suboxone contains buprenorphine and naloxone. It is used sublingually, which is under the tongue, or buccally, which is in the cheek. Naloxone is intended to oppose buprenorphine if injected IV to prevent euphoria and therefore minimize abuse potential, as well as reduce the risk of respiratory depression. However, whether this goal is actually realized is the subject of controversy. We can predict if this approach to protecting the user will work if we consider the dose of each substance in the formulation, the maximum concentration of each in the blood, the concentration of each needed to bind to the mu opioid receptor, that is, the main receptor responsible for the euphoria, pain relief, and respiratory depression, and finally, the elimination rate of each substance, also known as the half-life. Now let's look at the supporting facts in this argument. Just a warning, I'll be using some terminology specific to the field of pharmacology, but by the time I'm finished, I believe it will make sense, even if you have no background in the field. To be fair, we need to compare both components of Suboxone in a typical strength. Here we have 2 milligrams of buprenorphine and 0.5 milligrams of naloxone. The first thing I noticed is that they have similar affinity for the mu opioid receptor, which is measured by the KD, or dissociation constant. This simply means that they both bind to the receptor with about the same strength of attraction. However, as you may know, buprenorphine activates the receptor, whereas naloxone is an antagonist, that is, it blocks the receptor. So if I were to give an equal amount of each substance, just for argument's sake, by the IV route, they would each have about a similar likelihood of binding to the receptor, and of course they would compete with each other for binding. However, as you see here, buprenorphine is given at 4 times the strength of naloxone. This means that even immediately after injection, buprenorphine has the advantage over naloxone with respect to the likelihood of affecting the receptor. The other fact that I wanted to point out here is that buprenorphine's half-life exceeds 30 hours, whereas naloxone is about 1.5 hours. Half-life, by the way, is the time it takes for the blood concentration to decrease by 50%. So naloxone leaves the blood much, much faster than buprenorphine. It might be easier to look at this graphically, so let's see what the average concentration of each is in the blood over time if they were injected. Here it becomes obvious that naloxone is long gone from the blood within the first 7 or so hours after administration. However, buprenorphine is somewhere around 80 to 90% of its peak concentration at the same time that naloxone has disappeared. More importantly, buprenorphine's concentration far exceeds its KD, which means that the receptor is well over 50% occupied by buprenorphine at the same time that naloxone has already disappeared. And I didn't mention this, but the KD, not only is it a measure of affinity, but it specifically is defined as the concentration of the substance that binds to 50% of the receptors. So since we're well above that concentration, which is the blue dotted line here for buprenorphine, so the blood concentration is here. Since we're well above that, that means that we are well above 50% receptor binding. Now, technically, since this is just in the blood, we don't know that the brain concentration will match this, and usually it does not. Sometimes it's actually higher than the blood concentration, though. But we do know that naloxone has disappeared from the blood at this point, and by far the majority of it from the body as well. So this sets buprenorphine at quite an advantage for binding to that receptor. So in summary, the dose of naloxone in Suboxone is nowhere near enough to counteract buprenorphine, even in the first hour after administration. Between 5 and 10 hours, the concentration of naloxone in the blood becomes negligible, while buprenorphine is at 80 to 90% of its peak concentration. So the promise of naloxone being protective for those who attempt to use IV Suboxone is a false promise. Even though that's not the recommended route of administration, we need to consider that as a possibility to understand if naloxone will really do what it's intended to do. So the answer is it doesn't appear that it does. The only true protective feature in this formulation is actually the nature of buprenorphine itself. It is a partial agonist. Okay, so that means it cannot reach the same maximum effect as stronger opioids. So this wraps up our revelation on Suboxone, and I hope you all learned something with me here. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.